Hi, welcome to this week's edition of the Taming the Polar Bears presentations. This week's topic is music therapy. This is a new addition to the studio, my new whiteboard. I kind of screwed up. I didn't get the magnetic one. But anyway, today we are going to be talking about music therapy. I'm going to talk about a little more in a minute what I mean by music therapy, not what most people think. Mrs. Beans decided to join us here today. I don't know what she thinks of music, but she's purring. Maybe that's her kind of music. Music therapy, not what most people think. As I like to say, and I'll get into this a little more later, it's not just putting on some kind of favorite music and bouncing around and feeling uplifted and things like that. That's could be part of it, but that's kind of more just listening to music as anybody does. That's not really music therapy as I think of it. So, we're going to learn something different about music and how it applies to therapy. Okay, now, I don't talk about my story much anymore, but, and I don't want to get into it in great detail here, but, I had the worst type 1 bipolar. And I went through some things, when I went through years of drug therapy, that has known damaging effects to the brain. The type of stress and how a bipolar person experiences and processes stress is literally brain damaging. When you are in the depressive phase, as I technically more or less have been for the last about 3.5 years now, the depressive phase, the worst of the depressive phases, and these depressive phases worsen with age and time. Every time you go through bipolar cycles or rapid cycling or mixed episodes, elements of mania, elements of depression mixed together. Every time you go through those, the depressive stages will get worse and longer. So that is what I've been dealing with the last 3.5 years. There's a post on my blog called "The Mother of All Manic Depressive Episodes," kind of gets into some of the last 3.5 years. The last 4 years. Gets into the last 4 years in a little more detail. But a depressive episode, long depressive episode. I just happen to have, what we talked about in, the session on depression, vegetative catatonic states, anhedonia, psychomotor retardation. These are the things few people really experience. Brief periods, people will have experienced them for brief periods if they've battled some episode of major depression or clinical depression. And but there are, you start getting up into the harder cases that are treatment resistant and go on, we're not talking months, we're talking years. And the depressive phase of bipolar is very much like that, arguably worse because of the increased damage that comes from manic phases and the lack of sleep and the runaway, never-ending, burning energy of manic phases. I'm going to talk about all this, the biology of all, like we talked a little bit about the biology of depression. I'm going to talk about that in another episode. In any case, how I'm sorry, it's sometimes a little, well, it is hard to talk about, but I can't, it's very hard to relate how difficult it is, for anybody, but particularly a bipolar person, when you're used to your mind functioning at a very high rate, everything is go, go, go. And you find yourself in vegetative states, catatonic states, where there's just nothing, absolutely nothing. You can't process thoughts. You can't respond to things around you. And, the worst thing is you're aware of this. And, depending on a lot of life circumstances, life goes on, and you have to find ways to pay rent. You have to find ways to deal with life, and you're frozen for hours at a time. And even these catatonic vegetative states, they have their own kind of waves from, you can get up and move and take care of some really basic functions, or you're just knocked right out. This is where you'll see a lot of people just literally simply unable to get out of bed. And, I would manage that better than most, but, as far as being in any way, shape or form mentally or physically productive, it is quite literally impossible. I'm talking things, the simplest things I'd been able to do all my life, and I'd try to do them, and just, I couldn't process what was required to make simple arm movements and relate that to simple actions. So, anyway, that's where I was most severely 3.5 years ago, and I've spent lots of time in and out of states like that over the last 3.5 years. And, where I'd been able to recover, where I was able to get my mind, doing all the research, all those blog posts. If you look back on the last 3.5 years of my blog posts, every single one was written coming out of these states. If you talk to people about, I'll not talk to people, if you were able to read the right kind of material and talk to the right kind of people who understand my type of bipolar and the odds of being able to recover from that, without drugs, without, like I've said many times, I've done this on my own. No psychiatrist, no psychologist, no professional support of any kind. It's been the positive difference-making fundamentals that I laid out for myself and I've stuck to. But when I look at the cognitive and memory recovery I've been able to make happen for myself, and And it's interesting because I can visualize all the finest detail of stuff that goes on in the brain when these things aren't working and why they're not working. And which is why I stick so religiously to these programs I lay out. And then I, apply what I've learned, what music therapy does. Nobody can say with absolute certainty, because there's just no way to log it in a super scientific, accurate way. But, understanding how my mind's been able to recover, understanding the kinds of neurobiological things that happens to a brain that puts it in those vegetative catatonic states and the psychomotor retardation, like physically almost being unable to move or having difficulty moving. I would not be on Earth, to be perfectly honest. I would not have continued living like that. And I would not be doing the things I'm able to do today without music therapy. Okay, so that's, what I hope is kind of a bit of a powerful testimonial for music therapy. And what it'll do for the brain, what it can do for the brain, any brain, your brain. I've read some remarkable case studies about how music therapy can help people recover from, we can think the situation I just described about myself was terrible, but, it gets worse. There's always worse. And how music therapy can help people, in older age with dementia and Alzheimer's, recover from, brain damage in accidents, recover from stroke, recover from just about any kind of damage or condition to the brain that creates some kind of disabled symptoms. Okay, so now watch this business called music therapy. So let's, I'm going to move this here a little bit. So watch this business called music. Oops, I got to move this a bit more. Okay, so what's this business called music therapy? So, music therapy, let me just erase therapy here. Okay, so music, most people have their own idea about music. Music, food, many things, our ideas of it are shaped, are very subjective. They're very personal. Our personal taste in music and clothes, food, many things are very, very subjective. Our own personal tastes that were formed as we grew up, influenced by parents, friends, the culture we live in, many different kinds of things. And, so in our mind, we're going to have kind of a catalog of artists and songs and some basic genres of music, which for, us personally define what music is. So firstly, I would like us to get away, and I've got to move this even more. Firstly, I would like us to get away from, not I would like you, I need you to move away from your subjective understanding and taste in music. Because music therapy is not just listening to your favorite music. If you think that's what music therapy is, you're not going to get what music therapy is. You're not going to get the benefits of music therapy, okay? So I'm going to have to get a wireless gizmo for my microphone. Oh boy, I've got to move this even more. Sorry, folks. Yeah, so most people, when they think of music, they're thinking of subjective. There's subjective ideas. There's subjective taste. There's personal taste, and I have to kind of get you out of that and into a more objective understanding of what music is or can be. So, I kind of, as I said in one of my posts, I just kind of, I love music anyways, and I love exploring, and that it comes a little bit more naturally to me, but and I have to be really honest. I'm not really, trained in musical structure and things. I'm hoping, I've got a few people in mind that I'm hoping will join us in webinars to explain musical structure and how your ears and brain process that. But for now, I want to break down music into some really basic things. And I understand this a lot more now than when I kind of started doing my own music therapy program. But I'd like us to think of music more as sounds. And as I've explained, with our stress response system and all these things, our five senses, are like radar, bringing in visual information, auditory information, odor information, and these are going on all the time, and our circuitry, all the circuitry involved with processing sound and the deep limbic regions that I'm going to show you here in a minute, they're constantly scanning the surroundings for what's going on. So our brains, some neuroscientists believe what we're processing, the auditory information we're processing is more important than the visual, because our visual is just what's in front of us, where auditory is all around us. So how our brain processes auditory information is extremely important. And, as I understood, as I began to learn how all this stuff works in the brain to produce disorders like bipolar and schizophrenia, the more severe cases of anxiety and depression, and how it produces symptoms, a lot of the research and study I came across really pointed out how, for many of us, our auditory and this whole system for taking in sounds, sights and sounds, and processing that operates differently. More sensitive, reads more meaning into it, and I touched on that, I believe, 2 or 3 weeks ago in when I was talking about I think it was in the webinar on depression. Okay, so in this helps us set the table for why we want to use sound to kind of wire and recondition this whole system we have for taking in information, processing it, and creating behaviors, reactions, and so on, and emotions. Okay, so I want us for now to think of music as of sounds, different types of sounds that are auditory cortex and brains have to process, and how that information gets processed and how it produces, our behaviors and emotions and thoughts and things. Okay, so with that in mind, and sorry, so music, I want you to think of it as sounds, and I need you to kind of put aside your own personal subjective ideas, experience of what you think of as music, okay? Because the big part of how this program would work, what has to happen to make it work, is getting outside our previous experience, okay? Now, and therapy. Hang on, we got all kinds of new things here that I'm getting used to. So we have music and then the word therapy. Now the word therapy, like many words, has been taken by popular culture to mean something quite a bit different to most people than what it really should mean. We think of therapy as something to make us feel better. We're bummed, we're angry, we do something and we kind of feel that's therapeutic. So we have comfort food and eating therapy, shopping therapy. You're all bummed, go shopping, you'll feel better. And, so we get, if you'll notice, most of these things that are quote unquote therapy are just meant to make us feel better. And these actually become addictive behaviors. That's a whole different thing to get into explaining, but very well understood in the fields of psychology. And so, what a lot of what people do to make them feel better, and which they equate with the word therapy or therapeutic, are actually, things like drinking, things like taking different kinds of drugs, eating certain kinds of foods, doing certain kinds of behavior, even sex. And these things become so-called psychological addictions because we kind of condition ourselves to do these things when we feel bad, and they kind of make us feel better, but they become part of a cycle. You feel down, you feel bummed, you do this, whatever makes you feel good a little bit, that can't be sustained. All kinds of interesting neurobiology as to why all this is. You crash down again. And these create some of these emotional roller coasters I've been talking about, or that we kind of understand we go through, but not really why. And that's because we go through these, whenever we're feeling down or feeling, whatever, not good, we do something to make us feel better. That better feeling and the activity that creates it, is not sustainable for a long period of time. And then we calm down. If it's shopping therapy, you buy things you shouldn't have bought. So this is going to create all kinds of guilt and beating yourself up. And, this is what will happen with what most people think of therapy. This whole Taming the Polar Bears business is all about breaking these old cycles and patterns. And one of the ways we need to begin to change our thinking on all this is what this word therapy means. Now, when I use the word therapy in the phrase music therapy, I am talking more in the medical sense. And as I go through the rest of get towards the end, you'll understand this a little bit better. So when I'm talking therapy, I'm talking like something closer to, an actual, like physiotherapy, where you go in and there's specific things that are done to fix, given parts of your muscles and skeletal structure and all this stuff. Okay, so when I'm talking therapy, music therapy, I'm talking about how it's going to repair, change, calm, do all sorts of things for the actual physical structures of your brain, and in some senses, change some of the neurobiological things going on that creates mood swings. Okay, so again, that this term music therapy, when I write these posts on music therapy or talk about music therapy, this is what I'm talking about. I'm using different sounds that are going to have kind of almost a real physical therapeutic effect on brain structure. And I know there's people in the brain business who would freak out about that. But for our purposes here, that is really what's going to happen. And I'll try, I will outline that as we go along, okay? So now that you've endured my lecture on what music therapy means, what have I done with all my notes here? Here we go. Okay, so again, just to beat a dead horse, when we think of music for our music therapy program, we have to let go of our subjective personal taste ideas of what music is and open our minds to something different, okay? Now, if you saw my post on, I'm going to have to get this quite close here. If you saw my post on the neuroscience of music therapy, this is getting closer to what we're talking about. Straighten this up here a little bit. But as I wrote in the post, the different sounds involved in music will stimulate the brain more than any other activity you could do. Now, back to these vegetative states. And in that post, I talked about what happens in the brain if certain kinds of stimulation aren't ongoing. You get a lot of the kind of atrophy, and there's going to be two things. There's going to be certain kinds of damage, and and because of lack of use, brain connections are going to be lost, and this is going to be, create some of the things we experience with, difficulty in memory, difficulty recovering, recalling things that we should be able to, all kinds of cognitive difficulties associated with long-term, all the major psychiatric disorders. So when we're in these vegetative states, not only is the experience miserable and frightening and depressing in themselves, the longer we're in these vegetative states and the more we experience them, the more things are going to be happening in the brain that break down and create cognitive deficits and memory loss, and these things become a recurring cycle. The more the cognitive deficit, the more the memory loss, the worse, the greater the impact of this experience of depression. And this is where we're in the disease model. This isn't just, quit whining about it, get over it. We're talking very, very serious things going on in the brain here. And where I found, music therapy absolutely critical, and this is what I understood very quickly when I understood how all this worked in the brain and how we had to do something to stimulate neuronal networks, neurons and their networks, and the wiring when we can't do anything except just sit there and veg out. Okay, so in the original post, I wrote that nothing stimulates more brain areas than listening to music. Well, sorry, that's not true. Playing music, playing and moving to music is obviously more, but when we can't play music and we can't, if we're not able to physically move to music, then we need something that's going to stimulate all these different brain areas. So here we go. Where to start? Well, I'm going to start right down here, and I'll just briefly repeat some of these things. This was in the blog post. This is the cerebellum, really important for coordinating all kinds of body movement. When you're closing your eyes and touching your nose and stuff, your cerebellum is involved in guiding your finger to your nose. So a lot of coordination and fine physical movements. If you think of if you think of even something like a primate, monkeys, how they are able to coordinate all their body movements to do these fabulous things, jumping through the trees. That's an enormous amount of activity going on in the cerebellum. Now I connected the cerebellum. This is way deep down, in our bottom back part of our brain here. Very ancient bit of brain hardware. Has all kinds of important jobs, though. Besides physical movement, it coordinates all kinds of thoughts. It coordinates all kinds of things. This is really important to stimulate. If we're not moving around much, if we're not getting much exercise, this area is going to suffer, and therefore everything it does that we need it to do is going to suffer. Okay? Now up here in yellow, and this is the outer cortex. It's a layer of brain, about that thick, and it covers, our whole outer part of the brain. And it's got all these little weird folds and valleys and humps and stuff. That's the outer cortex. Up here, in this part that yellow, it kind of goes right over our head like this, sort of right about the middle. And it's called the motor cortex. Coordinates, every part of your body has a corresponding part up here, and that when you move your finger, that's stimulating certain little aspects up here. There's a whole kind of little map in here about where each body part relates to this area of the brain, and right next to it is the sensory cortex. And that's the tactile sensations. Okay, so if there's a stroke and you have paralysis and numbness, that'll be damaged in this area. Okay, so the cerebellum and these areas work very closely together to coordinate all kinds of movements. Even picking up a cup and guiding it to your mouth correctly requires all kinds of difficult coordination. And again, when we look at the symptoms, the more difficult symptoms involved in more difficult cases of depression and other psychiatric disorders, and we look at the psychomotor retardation, that's things, these areas are going to be involved, and also some really important stuff inside the limbic region that we've sort of looked at here and there. And listening to music gets neuronal connections and the coordinating networks all excited and stimulated, okay? Now, I think I'll move next onto the prefrontal cortex. This is an area way up in the front of our brain. invariably implicated in bipolar, major depression, schizophrenia, ADHD, well, kind of you name it. There's a psychiatric disorder. Something's going on up here that shouldn't be, or there's things that should be going on that aren't. And again, music helps really positive stimulation up here. When I talk about neuroplasticity, and music is very, very tightly connected to neuroplasticity, as I outlined in the post. There's negative plasticity, our brains changing in ways that are going to create negative effects, and positive neuroplasticity, the kind that we want to help our brains perform better and us perform better. So music is the right kind of music, not any kind of music, right kind of music is going to provide some really significant stimulation here. We have the auditory cortex. Now this, seems, pretty obvious that the auditory cortex is going to be involved in listening to music. The auditory, we don't see with our eyes, they just gather light, and we don't really hear with our ears. They just collect the sound waves. What we experience as sound is created in the auditory cortex. Now, briefly on that, a lot of things will be going on in there, some really interesting research. I've got a lot of personal insight into the auditory, what goes on in the auditory cortex. But, and I've touched on this before, and I don't have the time to get into this as much detail as I would like today. But when we're all these disorders, there's going to be, as I've been outlining and trying to really set the table with, there's going to be some real kind of hyperactivity, I'll call it, in the basic components of the stress response system, which I'm going to get to in a minute, and the various cortexes, like the visual cortex here and the auditory cortex, with the actual gathering the information, the visual information, the auditory information. And when we get to the extreme ends of that is when we start hearing voices, or thinking we're hearing things, seeing things, visual hallucinations. And, and I've experienced all those things, and I really, really wanted to understand where those things were coming from, because they were very, very, very disconcerting, I can tell you. That is, kind of what is known as maladaptive plasticity in the auditory cortex and the visual cortex. So these areas are very, very key to work on reducing stress-related information processing, I'll call it, these things that we associate with anxiety and panic and things, and the stress response system. Okay, I know this all sounds exceedingly and enduringly boring, but if you're going to understand what I mean by music therapy and why it's so important, we have to have a little bit better of an idea of what's going on and why. Okay, so we've looked at the stress response system. I'm not going to go into all this again, but I want to use this. One of the areas that's really, really important with music therapy, as I'm outlining it, is what's going on down here in the amygdala. Amygdala, again, is a tiny little brain nodule. There's two of them, one on each side, about the size of an almond, a little bigger than an almond. This is where emotions, fears, everything we associate with intense emotions of these various states we get ourselves into is processed in the amygdala. And as I briefly outlined, the amygdala itself is subdivided into all kinds of little regions. So we might have, there'll be, things to fear. There'll be a section in there that processes things to fear. That'll be hyperactive. Hypervigilant might be a better way to look at it. So many things associated with anxiety are rooted right here in the amygdala. And its job is to sense, we like I say, our eyes and ears gather all this information, and it's the amygdala's job to sort through that information and what to fear, what's a threat, what's not a threat. And in any case of anxiety, and just about any of these cases, again, we're talking about bipolar, schizophrenia, major depression, anxiety. There's going to be good parts of this, not all of it necessarily, but good parts of it related through fear and threats and things like that are hyperactive. And the amygdala, has very, very strong networks with the, because its job is to process information from all these things, from the visual cortex and the auditory cortex, very strong connections. So, a lot of what's happening when we are freaking out with anxiety and panic, and, we get to the point where we think we're hearing things, seeing things, and, we get to a point where we don't know what's what. And this kind of leads to a lot of the shutdown we experience, the overwhelm shutdown. And a lot of this overwhelm might be things that aren't really happening. It's because these areas are hyperactive and sending wrong signals or firing inappropriately. So a lot of music therapy is about calming down the amygdala, and done correctly and over time, reducing the actual physical size of the areas related to certain fears and things, and relatedly calming down the certain areas in the visual cortex and auditory cortex that are misfiring and creating a lot of the things we're experiencing. Okay, this was ridiculously important for me because I experienced a lot of auditory and visual hallucinations, really, really unpleasant. The extreme end of that is psychosis, extremely, extremely, extremely dangerous, and just, well, it was just awful. And so when I understood how all this stuff worked and what music could do, music therapy became job one for me. And again, not just bouncing around to happy music. Okay, so that kind of is what I'm talking about with when I think of music therapy is, if we think of physical therapy as fixing something wrong in our arm and muscles and bones and ligaments and tendons and things, I look at music therapy as literally kind of massaging isn't the quite the right word, but calming and sort of manipulating how all these systems work and getting, reducing a lot of the emotional overwhelm and the anxiety we experience. Okay, so that was rather intense and rambly. I swear I was going to keep this shorter, and I'm not. Let's see, I have now memories, the hippocampus. Here we are. Here's So, another area that's going to be strongly involved in processing music, the hippocampus. Hippocampus processes and stores and recalls memories. I called her filing lady in the post and episode on the stress response system. Now, this came up a few weeks ago about how music stirs negative memories. And we didn't quite manage to address that very well at the time, but I've been pondering that ever since. And this is where we get into the mistakes of what music therapy is and isn't, and what we should do with music. So with and I mentioned this a little bit in the post. This chart isn't very well, but the hippocampus and the amygdala, that little emotion processing center, work very, very closely together. Stimulate one, you stimulate the other. So this is an area we want music to really work on. This is where new memories are formed. This is where old memories are brought up. The old memory comes up, that stimulates the emotion, that creates a whole cascade of awful moods and things to deal with. So, again, when we're choosing how to create a music therapy program, a great deal of what we're doing is reducing negative stimulation in this kind of hippocampus amygdala pair, and they're actually almost physically connected. They work so closely together. And when I'm talking about neuroplasticity, now the adult brain doesn't create new neurons. Like the vast majority, in here, something like 80 billion neurons. Most of them, that's it. They formed when you were born, and that's it. But there's one area in the brain where new neurons are created, called neurogenesis, brand spanking new, right off the factory floor neurons, and that is in the hippocampus. So it is really, really important that you hear me on this. If we're going to design a music therapy program that's going to rejig all these negative memory associations and create new memories, and way back, one of my oldest posts is called Memory Functions in Major and Bipolar Depression. And that kind of applies to a lot of things with associated with negative moods and mental states and negative personalities and things. I understood a big part of what we have to do is create new memories by creating new experiences. That's kind of hard under a lot of circumstances, but you can do that anywhere, anytime with music. So again, with a kind of music is really, really important for what we're going to do. The therapy, the actual physical, and I am talking physical therapeutic effect in the brain. This is, ground zero for so many of our problems. And this is where we have to where we can really physically alter structure. Okay. So when I say, I could almost say neurophysical therapy or something like that, because this is what we want to alter. And in the hippocampus, this whole neuroscience, neuroplasticity biz, neurogenesis, the creation and giving new jobs to these new neurons is the holy grail of this whole business. And, your brain's not going to create new neurons to do old jobs. It's only going to create new neurons for new jobs, for new experience, new stimulation. So, if we're going to mince some new neurons and give them exciting new jobs to do, we need new experience, okay? So, I hope that gives you a little better idea of what I'm talking about with music therapy. And just briefly, I kind of mentioned the visual cortex. There's some important things we have to do there that music can do. And today's just an introduction. I have all kinds of exciting things to introduce and talk about with music therapy. There's all kinds of things we can do. Today's just an introduction, so we're not going to learn all about it today. Hang on, I've got a list here to keep me kind of on target here. Okay, so, oh boy, now I've lost my place here. Right, okay, so the hippocampus. So I'm just going to go back briefly. All the stuff we talked about in the stress response system. Like I say, this is ground zero for a lot of our problems. So let me try to outline a little bit about how we approach music therapy. Back 3.5 years ago, when I was simultaneously learning all this exciting stuff about the brain and going through all these horrendous things I went through, and it was very, very interesting. It was kind of bizarre in hindsight. This is going on internally, but I could have this sciencey person who was learning all this stuff kind of objectively observe all this stuff. But the conclusion I came to at some point, when we, this can happen at different phases in life. A lot of times, well, most often, almost always, when we have some kind of major bipolar episode, depressive episode, high anxiety, long high anxiety, panic attack-y type episodes, there's going to be some kind of major impact in our life, a really stressful event. And there's going to be massive brain-wide things going on that cause little microscopic damage. A lot of this damage and a lot of neurobiology thrown out of whack is what creates a lot of the symptoms we've been talking about. And when I I went into ridiculously enormously detailed looks into all of this. It's the brain is a ridiculously detailed thing. It's as I've said many times, the most complex biological organ in the known universe. There is nothing remotely comparable to it. And when I saw what was going on in the brain of a person, some kind of traumatic event, some kind of highly stressful event, and the cascade of things this will kick off. And these often manifest themselves in bipolar, extreme bipolar episodes, major depressive episodes, high anxiety, panic attack type things. And this persists. I mean, people sometimes go through these things and things work out, they come out of them okay. But I'm talking about cases where these persist and the symptoms persist and lives are disrupted. The person can't function as normal. And I understood what was going on in the brain to what caused the changes in the brain and what was going on in the brain to create the symptoms. And then at the same time, I was starting to look into quite a bit into what goes on in concussions. And lo and behold, concussions, a series of minor ones or major concussions, over time will create many of the same symptoms we're talking about with depression and the longer term effects of bipolar episodes and living with anxiety and all these things. And I began to see a lot of similarities, what's going on. And, meanwhile, outside of my own case, I'm talking to more and more people and hearing what's going on with them and how badly they were impacted, and imagining what was going on in their brains. I kind of concluded that when we get to these states, it is very, very much like a concussion. Different pathways for getting there, obviously, but the end physical result, the actual impact on our mental states and ability to function were startlingly similar. Not exactly the same. There's this gets very, very technical in neuroscience biz stuff, but so I concluded, as I've been trying to get across, it's very hard to get people to take this seriously. Even for the people suffering it, they just want it to go away any way possible. I found this as I started trying to help people. They just want something to happen, and they hate what's going on, but they just want it to go away. At the same time, they have trouble taking it seriously. It's one of those weird things in the whole mental health, mental illness business. But I felt we should approach it like concussion. And I looked into all kinds of concussion recovery protocol. Like this is where athletics gives us an amazing real world lab, because this goes on all the time. These people get the best care in the world there is. So I thought, okay, what are these people doing? And there's a whole concussion recovery protocol. And that person, super famous athlete, like these are some of the most physically fit and brain fit people on earth. And this is what they have to do when going through concussion protocol. So there's the long and the short of that is there's a whole pace to the recovery. Things start off lots of rest. Lots of, low stimulation, not, I talk about brain stimulation. That can mean many different kinds of things, but basically it means not putting any kind of difficult load on the brain. You think of a damaged arm. If you damaged your arm and it had serious damage, required surgery, blah, 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 there would be a whole therapy recovery protocol for that. Week 1, 2 weeks immobilization. Don't use the damn thing. And then there would be a whole pace to the recovery of that. Certain injuries, it'll be months and months. That's just a simple, this is a really straightforward thing. It's just some bone and muscle, and the brain is vastly more complex. So, I looked at it, okay, we have to look at, when we get these states and these people I talk to in these horrendous states, we have to kind of look at it like concussion protocol. So back to music therapy. I realized we kind of, to try and get you to understand this better, there's kind of 3 kind of phases that we want to go through, and these might vary depending on the time. So there's one that's just calming. You know, the brain has to stay active. You know, just like even if we have a physical injury and we have to, you know, kind of demobilize the arm or whatever it is, you know, things like circulation and some minor muscle stimulation has to go on. Otherwise things will atrophy or, you know, other damage will happen. So, you know, a lot of, you know, how I approach music therapy is, you know, we have to, you know, let our mind rest and heal, let our brains rest and heal, yet we need some low-level stimulation. A good analogy might be, you know, certain kinds of therapy where, you know, say the bones can't move, but they need to stimulate the muscle. They put on those little electrode things that just kind of, you know, make the muscle twitch. So you maintain circulation and some muscle activity without disturbing bone structure or ligaments or whatever it is. And so we can think that's kind of one way I think of music therapy. And you know what I'd really rather not get to with those vegetative catatonic states. I highly recommend not going that far. So what I realized in hindsight when I looked at my whole long case history, you know, if I'd approached this all differently years ago, if I had somebody to coach me through all this better years ago, well, people would try. People would suggest meditative music and stuff, but I you know, I had no idea why or you know, what's this going to do? So now I'm telling you what I wish I understood years ago. So, you know, whether you're as bad as I got, which is unlikely, or you're headed that way, we want to prevent that. Either way, there's this kind of calming phase where we have to get as much rest as possible, yet still have some low-level stimulation. So there's, you know, and this is where we get into music as sounds. And there's some really, really interesting science on this that I haven't poked into completely to my satisfaction. But, you know, our brains have different brain waves. This coordinates a lot of things as well, very important in memory consolidation, sleep waves, different things. And there's music. You know, music isn't quite the right word, I guess, but sounds that help work with our brain waves and coordinate them in important ways. Now, I haven't quite gotten into how the science of that. I roughly understand it, but not comfortably enough to make any solid advice there. But a lot of what I just came across, what I listened to a lot, was meditative music. And on Sunday, I'm going to present some examples of that kind of thing. And, you know, a lot of meditative music is out of the East. You know, Eastern philosophy and kind of the whole approach to mental health is kind of thousands of years ahead of the West. You know, like I've said many, many times, none of this is new to the human experience. People have been dealing with this for thousands of years. It is nothing new. It's more widespread and prevalent today because of all kinds of changes in the modern world. But a lot of these things have been happening for you know, throughout human history. And so a lot of sounds have been created, kind of musical meditative sounds, that over hundreds and thousands of years have been designed to do exactly what we need to be done in our brain. Okay, so there's this calming kind of phase. This might just be certain parts of the day. This might be longer periods of weeks where we really have to work on just calming sounds and lots kind of sounds of nature. If you go to YouTube, a lot will have some kind of very nice visual things to look at, calming nature scenes and things. And this all calms. We use these together. If we use the right kind of sounds, this really calms down a lot of this hyperactivity in the auditory cortex that's creating a lot of the anxiety and things that we're experiencing, and kind of fear-related, what's going on type experiences, and in the visual cortex. Because in our, this is kind of one of the big differences in the modern wacky world. These there's just too much going on around us. And these areas and all the connections down to the amygdala and to the amygdala and the hippocampus, these all become hyperactivated. And this is what's creating a lot of what we're experiencing. So all these areas, like tiny neuronal networks and the larger connections between them, need to be calmed down. So that's kind of a really important point. This is, if I go back to my concussion protocol, what goes on in the beginning, as little stimulation, normal day-to-day activity type stimulation as possible, as much rest as possible, turn off the news, turn off all these sources of information that our brains can't handle anymore, and focus on calming sights and sounds and certain types of musical sound. They're very, very well designed for that very thing. Okay, so that's kind of one stage. Now, the other, coming back to my kind of, where I understood what's kind of like literally broken in our brains and damaged, and how this kind of correlated a lot to what we see in concussion damage, kind of brings us to the next step, recovery. So we a lot of what's going on with you, I'd like you to think of, and I know this sounds scary, but it's better if we face what's really going on and take it seriously, is, when I say brain damage, people think like a major stroke or some major injury, blunt trauma injury or something. And then, that's the extreme end of things. But when we're, like I say, been through traumatic experiences, a lot of difficult life experience, a lot of difficult mental experiences, and we get into the final meltdown states where, all these serious symptoms we've been looking at, the reason our brains aren't functioning properly is actual physical damage, broken down things, broken down little micro brain bits and things that are hyperactive. There's all kinds of things out of whack, and that needs to be repaired and put in better place. Again, this is all where neuroplasticity comes in. This is what neuroplasticity in a lot of senses is just the brain's way of healing itself. And, again, when I talk about therapy, I'm talking about literally healing, not abstract concepts like soul and mood and stuff. I'm talking about actual brain structure. Okay? So, there's kind of, these can be sort of long-term over months. Sometimes they're, they can even be within shorter periods. We need a bit of calming and then some slow recovery stuff. And, you know, again, the recovery, we want to, you know, back to kind of positively stimulating all these areas. And, you know, and again, you know, a lot of this involves higher cognitive function and memory. And who doesn't have trouble with that in, you know, just normal aging, but with ongoing cases of anxiety, stress, mood disorders, major depression, bipolar, all these things, you know, cognitive impairment, memory impairment is going to be part of the picture. So, you know, and this is what we can recover. It is recoverable. That's kind of what I'm trying to state with my case, because I like to repeat. My prognosis looked very, very, very grim. You are not supposed to be able to recover as I have, as much as I have, from what and where I was been and what, you know, bipolar put my particular brain through. Okay, so it's much of this is recoverable. So we need, you know, again, when we're designing a music therapy program, we want certain kinds of stimulation all throughout the brain here that's going to recover a lot of function, repair a lot of damage, and get us, you know, our brains operating in a way that will get us through life. So that's, you know, that's what as I've said, that's what the brain's #1 job is. I've repeated this, I don't know how many times in the blog, is to get your fanny through life. And a lot of the times we're melting down and crippled with fear and anxiety and all these things. It's our brain's not getting us through life. There's all these consequences and stuff. So a lot of what we experience is recoverable. So there's sort of a whole recovery aspect. Okay, so these, you know, again, if we come back to our concussion protocol and recovery protocol, and the screen's frozen here. Yeah, sorry, there we go. Okay, so if we come back to our concussion recovery protocol and kind of think of our own recovery, and that's, we have this kind of calming, getting everything calmed down, resting with some low level stimulation going on. You know, a lot of what I said, there's many brain regions that have been hyperactivated, and what can happen is the brain, many parts of the brain fire inappropriately, and this is creating a lot of what we're experiencing. So these things all have to be calmed down. There's kind of a damage, we'll just call it a damage recovery repair phase. Let's put repair in here. Then the exciting part, folks, is creating the real exciting part of neuroplasticity. You know, again, when we go back to the hippocampus, let's look at this bigger picture, the hippocampus, all this memory processing. If we do this right, we can stimulate brand spanking new neurons. We can create all kinds of new things, all deep inside this deeper limbic area, emotional processing area, and throughout our vaunted cerebral cortex and frontal lobes. And this is the long-term goal and picture. You know, music's just one way. It just, like I said in the post, it's kind of the yeast that's going to get this whole bread going. But, you know, when I talk so often about how I believe how much you can recover and how much is on the other side of where you are now, this kind of terrible place where you are, where you're going through all these terrible symptoms and your life sucks and everything feels like it's going to hell in a handbasket, or you're already to hell in a handbasket. And there's another side to that. There's so much your brain can do. You don't have to stay where you are. So, but we have to get through these phases. And then the real exciting phase, people, and then I'm going to draw this to a close, is we create curiosity, learning. Oops, I screwed that up. Learning and growth. This is where we get past where we are. As I tried to sort of emphasize throughout the blog, we want to get beyond where we are, this shitty place where we are. We have to change. We have to change in multiple ways. We're not going to change our lives. We're not going to change what's going on in our mental states if we somehow don't change. Change is very scary to a lot of people, sounds impossible, can't. You will be told this over and over and over again. Our society and sort of long-standing predominant, even brain science, long held that, we can't change. This is, as the die is cast, as the twig is bent, leopard can't change its spots, all these things we hear that's says we can't change. We absolutely can. I've got a whole broadcast and new post on change with just demolishes this myth that we can't change. But people, to change, we have to change how our brain functions. And a lot of that is this kind of this is very, very simplified, but calming down what's going on, recovery and repair, and learning and growth into something new. Okay, so I am going to tie that off here now. Just to leave off, as I emphasize again and again in the blog and my approach, and if you talk to me, I will tell you the same thing over and over again. There are no quick fixes to this. Again, lots of things have gone wrong in your brain. There's damage. There's things that have built up over a lifetime. That is all changeable, but it takes time and specific things to happen. And that's what the whole Taming the Polar Bears program is about. And that's why I've been able to recover and change as much as I have and tame my bipolar bears. And again, this is not supposed to happen. And so to get you there, you have to understand that it takes time. There's no magic bullets. There's multiple approaches. Music therapy is only one important aspect. You're probably getting bored of this, but there are multiple aspects we have to approach to get this thing repaired and working much better. And regardless of your age, it is possible for it to work better than it ever has in your life. But we have to kind of understand what's going on, go through these phases, and music is only part of this. There's other things we need to learn and understand as well, things like diet, hydration. Some of it is really, really basic stuff. But we can get you through this and into, I think, the best years of your life. Okay, so again, if you're coming across this and you have no idea who I am or what all this polar bears business is, most of a good deal of my story and a lot of what I've discovered and written about is at tamingthepolarbears.blogspot.ca. That's my blog. You can it's a huge kind of thing. It's a bit of a mess right now, but you can poke around in there and get a bit of an idea. I do work privately with people, or if you have any questions, you can write to tamingthepolarbears@gmail.com, and you will be handled nicely and put in touch. And I hope to hear from you, and we will see you in the webinar this Sunday. So thank you for joining me, and we'll see you again soon. Bye now.